A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. I work at a low-key diner in a small town, the kind of place that serves grease-drenched fries and all-day breakfast, where regulars come to sip overly sweetened coffee and swap gossip that echoes off the chipped linoleum. It was a job that I took out of necessity more than passion, especially since my mom had just recently fallen sick, and I had all the bills piling up at home. My coworker, Karen, is the kind of person who thrives on petty drama. She's got a knack for turning mundane requests into full-blown crises. She's also been eyeing my Wednesday morning shift, my only early day, like a hawk, but I'd made plans to take my mom to her bi-weekly therapy session, a rare opportunity for us to reconnect, as my work schedule often monopolized my life. It was during one of her endless complaints about her own commitments that she launched into a full-on crusade, convinced that I, the selfish employee, was sabotaging her chances for success. I politely declined when she first asked to swap shifts, citing my prior obligation, but that only seemed to snowball into her relentless barrage of guilt trips and passive-aggressive remarks. "You don't care about anyone but yourself," she huffed one night during closing, flicking the fryer switch off with far too much force. "Some people have real ambitions." I tried to shake off her words, but they clung to me like sweat-soaked uniforms. I thought maybe I was being unreasonable, and since people love to insist that kindness is a two-way street, I made the mistake of texting her one evening to see if we could reach some understanding, joking that I could trade my early shift for her Saturday night, which is the busiest time at the diner, hoping this would make her think twice. But Karen was relentless. She acted like I'd committed treason. Soon I was receiving messages from other co-workers, who were also under her spell, asking me why I couldn't just be a team player, to do it for the family of the diner. It started to feel like a witch hunt, but I stood firm. I couldn't lose my one chance to spend quality time with my mom. The weight of my decision hit harder one night when I overheard Karen talking in the break room, plotting ways to undermine my credibility. She painted me as the villain to anyone who'd listen, saying I was sabotaging her dreams while simultaneously tearing down my work ethic like I was the problem ruining her life. I couldn't comprehend how a simple shift swap had turned into something so twisted. Was I really the antagonist here? A part of me thought about just giving in, but the memory of my mom's face during our last appointment reminded me of what I was fighting for. A tiny but fierce part of me didn't want to grant Karen the satisfaction of having made me yield. As weeks dragged on, I noticed strange things happening. Orders would come in for tables I wasn't assigned, the ice machine would mysteriously malfunction, and patrons oohed over the burnt toast that I'd swore I never cooked. It got to a point where I almost felt like I was being bullied at my own job, a chilling sensation creeping over me that Karen had somehow turned the rest of the staff against me. One particularly chaotic Saturday, I was hit with the nausea-inducing news from my boss that I would need to take a 2-week indefinite leave due to additional training. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but I heard the laughter in Karen's eyes when I left the break room. With my heart racing, I pulled up the diner's group chat later that night, only to see Karen had shared a meme about a greedy coworker that looked suspiciously like me. The blind rage surged within me because I was sick of her games, but it wasn't until the night of my mom's treatment that everything spun out of control. Sitting in the waiting room, I suddenly received a frantic text from my coworker Sarah, warning me that Karen had taken my shift, and I knew she'd done it just to make a point. Panic gripped me, an icy hand squeezing my insides as I reflected on how low she would sink just to win a petty fight. I rushed back to the diner, yelling at the owner, but he was too mesmerized by Karen's shining performance behind the counter. I left, heartbroken and nauseated, feeling trapped in a web of everyone else's delusions. But it was that anger that eventually propelled me forward. I swore I would no longer allow anyone to dictate how I conducted my life. So with a heavy heart, I made a plan. I kept my mom's treatment notes clutched to my chest, carefully documenting every absurdity about the diner and getting to know my coworkers better. The next time I stepped in that diner, I was armed not just with memories, but intent and vengeance. It was no longer about the shift, it had morphed into a catalyst to take down a toxic work environment once and for all. As the weeks passed, I slowly began gathering support, showing my colleagues the truth behind Karen's facade, and it wasn't long before the memes and whispers flipped on her. The tides turned swiftly. She was out of the restaurant and back to being the messy, bitter person she had always been, while I finally reclaimed my time with my mom. I may have felt guilt at first for refusing to give in, but sometimes putting yourself first is the only way to stop a bigger issue. It was the hardest battle I had gone through yet, but I emerged victorious, with lessons learned, with scars that whispered reminders that no matter how vitriolic the world becomes, integrity always matters more. After all, being a team player doesn't mean losing yourself in someone else's game. When I suggested to my friend Jenna that maybe she shouldn't have chosen her sperm donor based on just one photo and a clever description, I never expected it would escalate to the chaotic whirlpool of dread that engulfed both our lives. Jenna had always been the dreamer in our friendship. While I was practical and often skeptical, she floated through life with optimism, determined to become a mother without a partner. I celebrated her resolve, but when she finally went through with the insemination after poring over the profiles of anonymous donors, I felt a chill in my spine as if I could already sense the impending disaster lurking in her choice. It all seemed wonderful at first, her joyous announcement, the joyous chatter of our group, her glowing features as she cradled her burgeoning belly. But the euphoric bliss quickly shifted when Jenna began receiving strange messages on her social media from an account with no profile picture, the tone gradually shifting from benign curiosity into unsettling comments regarding her pregnancy. I urged her to report the user and shut it all down, but Jenna was convinced they were just a passionate fan, someone intrigued by her and her journey into motherhood. I could only look on with mounting uneasiness, whispering silent prayers that my gut instinct was wrong. As weeks dragged on, the messages took a darker turn, each one painted with the brushstrokes of obsession, fragments of personal details only someone from her life could know, revealing they were more than just a faceless stranger behind a screen. Jenna laughed it off, but her eyes flickered doubt the night she received a photo, a grainy image of herself, taken from the street as she had walked home alone after work. My heart raced. I knew I couldn't remain passive anymore, so I insisted we dig deeper. The more we searched, the more horrifying the discovery became. It turned out her donor had a history of erratic behavior, one too close for comfort to criminal activities that were chilling in nature. He was a ghost of his past, still linked to a chilling personal philosophy that revolved around obsessive control and dominance. I confronted her with everything we had found, the fortune of research and our lies like poetry turned tragic, but instead of finding understanding, Jenna's face twisted in betrayal as she spat her anger at me for making her second-guess her dreams. Hurt rained down on our friendship like an avalanche. She stormed out, leaving me to grapple with the suffocating notion that I might have crossed a line, yet deep down, I knew that her unborn child, my potential godchild, was at stake. A week passed without contact until one dreary Tuesday evening, as rain lashed against the windows, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. "I need you right now," it said, echoing with heaviness that pulled me from my chair to her door. What I found when I arrived was a realm of horror. Her apartment was plunged into darkness, the living room, curtains drawn as though to shun all light, carrying a musky odor of fear and anxiety. "I can't trust anyone," she whispered, holding her phone as if it were a lighthouse guiding her way through a storm. I felt my pulse quicken as she explained how she had begun hearing footsteps trailing her at work, the sensation of someone watching her every move, the whispering of dark secrets in passing conversations, heightening her paranoia like weeds consuming a garden. I took her hand, holding on as tightly as I could as I assured her this had to end. I vowed to help her confront whatever demons were lurking in the shadows, never once imagining the true monster we were about to unearth. That night, we couldn't sleep. We swapped theories, dissecting every lead that had felt like a thread coming unraveled. After hours of fear-filled chatter, we decided to confront the sperm bank, hoping for answers tied to the donor's identity that could sever the invisible tether weaving into our lives. Little did we know our innocent intentions unspooled into a web of horror. When we reached the office, the receptionist's glazed look was extraordinary, her voice hollow as if rehearsed. She finally handed us the consent forms, revealing a nonchalant warning that there was another use for the donor's genetic material aside from standard insemination, a program that allowed embryos to be artificially implanted in a laboratory under certain conditions. I was nauseated, unable to reconcile how something that should have brought life could lead us down this harrowing rabbit hole. Jenna's eyes widened with dread as we began connecting the dots, realizing the sleepless nights terrified by an unseen hand were merely a prelude to something more sinister. I felt a sudden tingling at the back of my mind, a wild realization. Jenna's donor wasn't just searching for potential children, he had created his own family of twisted fantasies, feeding off the lives entwined in his web like a spider waiting. That night, Jenna was up all night panting, emotionally shattered as the uncertainty of her situation spiraled. As dawn broke, I vowed that we would no longer remain silent. Together, we started piecing together the breadcrumbs of horrible truth, approaching police who, at first, brushed us off as paranoia, but with sheer determination, we persuaded them to launch an investigation into the donor's unsettling past. The story exploded in agonizing detail. The whispers of hacked accounts, stalking, obsessive rages came to light. But what truly shattered us was the realization that he had indeed been weaving his threads into Jenna's life. As I stood by her that morning in the police station, two shadows of raw fear intertwined, I couldn't shake the reminder that this was all a consequence of a single choice, a single photo, the life-changing decision of picking a sperm donor. The aftershocks of that moment still reverberate in our lives, and as she holds her child now, I can't help but wonder, AITA for trying to help my friend? I wish I could say that love conquers all, but sometimes the darkness finds a way, lurking in the periphery of our naive dreams, waiting to pounce. I thought I was doing the right thing when I invited my daughter, Ella, to my wedding. It was supposed to be my special day, a celebration of love that I had waited so long for, yet it quickly turned into a nightmare that threatened to unravel everything I had built. The wedding was supposed to be child-free, a choice my fiancé and I made after years of hearing the endless howls of kids at weddings, tugging at their parents' dresses, sticky hands everywhere, but I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving Ella with a babysitter that night. Her big, brown eyes filled with trust seemed to pierce through my steely resolve. I had spent so much time and effort planning this day, but the real truth gnawed at my insides. My ex-husband and the battles over custody had stripped so much joy from my life, the kind of joy that only a parent knew. Ella was not just my daughter, she was my greatest happiness in a life littered with heartbreak. When the day finally arrived, I felt a tension knotting my stomach. My friends raised eyebrows over Ella's presence, some shot disapproving glances as she twirled in her little dress, a tiny sunshine among the cynical clouds of adult resentment. I tried to brush off their comments, reassure them that she would be quiet, but deep down I feared this decision would come back to haunt me. As we exchanged vows beneath a blooming arch, Ella's laughter punctuated the solemnity of the moment, the sound bouncing off the walls of our carefully chosen venue, and for a fleeting second, I thought that maybe I had made the right choice, that love was expansive, that it could include the children we cherished. But as the reception began, chaos erupted in a way I couldn't have imagined. Ella, normally so sweet and well-mannered, seemed to sense my anxiety. She fidgeted around the table, her previous joy twisted into a frantic whirl of energy. Guests looked on with thinly veiled discomfort, and when she knocked over a whole tray of hors d'oeuvres, the loud crash reverberated around the space like a gunshot. The laughter quickly faded into whispers, the sight of my fiancé's face crumpling into pale frustration. "This is supposed to be a special day for us, can't you control her?" He hissed through clenched teeth, and I felt my heart splinter at his words. How could he say that? She was my daughter, my little miracle bathed in sun, and in that moment, the words felt as sharp as knives. I tried to explain, tried to apologize to my guests, who were visibly uncomfortable watching my face turn crimson with embarrassment, but I could feel the judgments rise like a palpable fog, affecting even the tightest of relationships, crumbling them beneath unseen pressures. A few brave souls tried to coax Ella back into calmness, but when I witnessed her slip into the shadows, a cute little flower girl becoming a confused little shadow, I rushed after her, desperate to find her back. It was in a small alcove near the bathrooms that I first saw it, a dark figure looming. It had to be a trick of the light, perhaps a misstep of my imagination, but the way its shadows stretched unnaturally across the tiled wall made my stomach holler. I took a step back in hesitation, but Ella laughed to greet the figure, drawing closer as it engulfed her in a cold haze. Panic clawed inside me, and I lunged for her as the figure raised a pale hand that flickered like a dying bulb. "Ella, come back!" I screeched, my voice a shriek that sliced through the laughter drifting from the reception. I yanked Ella into my arms just in time, and our eyes locked, a wondrous mixture of fear and diligence coiling in her innocence, shadows shattering beneath the flickering lights above us, replacing laughter with an ominous hum. My fiancé and the guests had begun to filter toward us, drawn by my sudden panic as I tried desperately to shield her from the darkness that prowled around the corners where no one dared to look. He was furious, and when he saw how scared I was, his anger morphed into confusion, but when he looked upon Ella, my precious girl clutching my hand with terror etched into her little features, his warmth shattered. I saw it, the way his eyes flicked back to the figure, now hovering silently, a spot of ink threatening to consume my life in darkness. People were gasping as the words fell from my lips, things I could barely comprehend. It's coming for her. But as I tried to urge him to flee, to run, the shadows engulfed the light, filling the room with whispers of my past regrets, and it seemed uncertainty struck him harder than fear, causing him to freeze as the figure drew ever closer, the darkness twirling around like wisps of smoke. As the chaos descended, guests fled to the corners, drawn into their own fears and superstitions, even if no one truly understood what was happening, and I was left holding Ella, the weight of my choices crashing like waves against my breastplate. The figure began to laugh, a twisted, echoing sound like shattered glass, and as I turned away from it to shield my daughter from the chaos, I felt the warmth seep from my soul. Nobody was coming to help. Desperation clawed at me, and with one last surge of strength, I broke free from the icy void, pushing through friends and family, shivering against the noise that raged around me to escape into the night. We barely made it to the car, the headlights flickering like the sanctity of promises broken, as that chilling laughter still echoed behind. Inside, the air grew thick with tension, a web of haunting memories woven in silence, and I tried to comfort Ella, but the truth hung in the air like a dark cloud. We barely escaped, but we still bore the burden of fear, of choices lost to shadows yearning to reclaim what it could never have. Some may say I was the villain of my own story, AITA for bringing her where she was never meant to be, but in that darkness, I started to realize that the real question was how far I would go to protect my daughter from an entity that represented all my past mistakes, draped in the guise of love and light. As we drove away, Ella's gentle question pierced through the suffocating veil, "Mom, are we ever going back?" And I didn't have an answer. I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I'd take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. "Hey! You shouldn't be here." It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. This area's reserved. Get lost. I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. People are just doing their thing, my father said over breakfast. You know how the hunters can get. But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. You hear me? I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. You can't scare me off my own land. Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. Show yourself, I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. Mighty brave of you to come here, he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. You think you have more claim to this land than I do? Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. This is my family's land, I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. You're nothing but a trespasser. Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now. The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. You don't own this place, I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, and you're not welcome here. His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. You think you can keep me away? He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. What's going on? My father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. This land should have been theirs long ago, he whispered venomously, but sometimes, the strong take what they want. I felt my breath seize in my throat, I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. Run, I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted, fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. "What are you doing?" my mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me. Anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, "He wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him." With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. I just wanted him to have fun, he muttered, eyes cast downward. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. What's going on? Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pain of desperation as I fought to find the right words. Mark, you're losing us. The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams, hexing him with my furious stare. I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun and a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life, while I had committed to ours. But things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then. I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent. I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls, the air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal, sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark. I never thought I'd have to justify teaching my daughter the importance of sleep, but the day I found myself sprawled across the living room floor, heart racing and eyes wide open, was when I realized everyone views the world through their own lens, even my 8-year-old. It started innocently enough. Mia was a bright, curious kid who preferred late-night readathons over the weaknesses of sleep. She'd marathon Magic Tree House stories until the early morning hours, and it didn't help that her school started later in the day. I was worried, of course, but I never thought her nightly habit could twist into something darker until I started seeing the whispered shadows creeping around our home late at night, at first, mere figments of my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But soon, I began to hear them too, soft whispers in the dark, grating against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard. They'd slither around my ears and seep into my dreams, taunting me with secrets that rattled my bones. I tried talking to Mia about how her late-night escapades were weaving a web of sleeplessness, but how could I compete with the enchanting stories she conjured in her imagination? One evening, desperate for a solution, I devised a plan. I would create a reward system for her to go to bed on time, embellishing it with the promise of being more energized and focused during the day. I thought I had struck gold when she eagerly agreed, all while those shadows shrieked in amusement, relishing in my naivete. The first few nights were a struggle as Mia cried for her books, but eventually, she started accepting her new bedtime. It all peaked when I noticed the whispers still darting around me, telling me it was too late to reverse everything, that maybe I should let her stay awake so they could find her, an absurd thought that sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. One night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just finished reading to her instead of the usual bedtime story. It was a thrilling old fairy tale, a diversion from my own creeping dread, almost lulling me into a trance as I tucked her in. But as I did, I saw the shadows cast onto her wall, impossibly long and grotesque, almost resembling hands trying to grab her. It was ridiculous, terrifying even, yet mesmerizing. My heart pounded in rhythm to the whispers, the urgency palpable in the air. "She must stay awake, join us," they seemed to chant. I flipped on the nightlight, banishing the darkness to its corners, and she squeaked out a frightened "Daddy, are they coming for me?" My laughter cut through the air, a desperate attempt to cloak what I felt was creeping closer, but there was no hiding my terror from her wide, unsettling eyes. I spent the night monitoring her, a pit of dread building as I realized the whispers had become frantic, feverishly relentless, urging me to let my daughter know she was safe, but I felt increasingly uncertain of my own sanity. That was my breaking point, and in an act of desperation, I whisked her away and enrolled her in a sleep training program I had read about online. They said it would teach her both the importance of sleep and ensure restful nights. But the horrified look in Mia's eyes, begging me not to leave her during our first session, tore me apart. Yet I pressed on, my mind firmly convinced it was for her own good, for a small sense of normalcy. Sessions churned into weeks, and while Mia took her lessons to heart, I was left spiraling deeper into sleepless desperation. Each night felt longer, and the whispers invested more time in raking my mind over the coals of dread. She doesn't need you, she'll choose to join us soon. It haunted my dreams, transforming her laughter into disturbing echoes as I tossed and turned in worry. I desperately reached out to other parents, but in our social media group, my pleas were met with laughter. Come on, it's just sleep. You are not being called to join the Sandman, they chuckled, but each laugh cut deeper until their amusement morphed into derision. Before long, they had tagged me as the overprotective dad who couldn't let go, further isolating me. I deployed strategies I'd learned in my own sleep-deprived state, led by what they advised rather than what felt right. I pushed her limits, enforced rules, and even barricaded her bedroom door with pillows, a move that causes waves of shame to ripple through me now. That night, the shadows slipped under her door, engulfing my household, murmuring vehemently, and I swear I could see them reaching for her. Tina, my wife, had long since given up. To her, Mia's sleep rebellion had graduated into another anecdote from a baffling father. I could hear her whisper late at night, "You're being overbearing," but every absence of sleep kept straining at my desperation. One fateful evening, the whispers crescendoed, echoing through the walls, and in a moment of sheer terror, I rushed into Mia's bedroom. The room was dim, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon spilling through her window, and there was Mia, soundlessly sleeping, but the voices screamed louder, almost erupting from the very corners of the room. She must choose, she must choose. In an act of panic and fear, I picked her up, shaking her awake, shouted for her to get up. It's important she stays alert, but my wide-eyed daughter crumpled in protest, her face stricken with fear. I was thrust into the horror unfolding before me. The shadows coiled tighter around me as I cradled her, horrified at how they began to flicker in the corner of my vision. They wanted her. In an all-consuming frenzy, I dropped her back on her bed and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath as if I had disrupted an ancient ritual. Had I doomed us both? The next morning was met with a silence that pinched my conscience, and when I approached Mia's room, I found it empty. My heart plummeted, 1,000 terrified thoughts racing through my mind. I dashed through the house, frantically searching, but the only noise that greeted me was the echo of my breath against the walls. It was then that I remembered the voices saying they would wait. Her door creaked open, and I felt their presence encircle me, still lingering like an unshakable chill. I tore back to where the shadows had taken me, and my hands fumbled to pull open the old closet door, revealing only impenetrable darkness, and there was Mia, but caught in a trance, a pitiful expression on her face. I would pay any price to pull her from that abyss, back into my arms where she belonged. When she returned to me moments later, her eyes focused once more, I held back my tears. It was all my fault. I had taken away the only shield she had against the shadows, her bedtime stories that filled our lives with imagination and warmth. As I cradled her, I made a decision. I would let her have her stories once more, even if it meant I could never truly sleep again. The importance of sleep suddenly became the echoes that trailed behind us, a gentle reminder of what dreams truly held. Though I still yearn for quiet nights, I realize the cost of my lessons was far too high. Am I the jerk for trying to teach my daughter the importance of sleep, or have I simply opened a door I can never close again? A few weeks ago, I found myself embroiled in a family feud that spiraled so quickly into something inexplicable, it still sends shivers down my spine. My cousin Amelia, who is a year younger than me, had a tendency toward excessive socializing, practically inviting half of our high school to any gathering we had, regardless of the time or place. But this year, Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, and after nearly 2 decades of noisy celebrations filled with the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie, I had my fill of her friends slumped on our couches or rummaging through the fridge, oblivious to any boundaries. So, when she announced excitedly that she was planning to invite her entire friend group over for Thanksgiving, I snapped. I told her she couldn't do that. "Amelia, this isn't a party, it's Thanksgiving," I said, my voice a mix of irritation and concern. With tears threatening to spill, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and I thought little of it at the time. Yet soon after, the atmosphere around the house shifted, as if a thick fog had rolled in uninvited. I dismissed it as the usual family tension, until the day before Thanksgiving, when everything escalated dramatically. That evening, I was alone in my room, scrolling through social media when I heard an unsettling sound, like the distant echoes of laughter and mingling voices, muffled by the walls. At first, I thought it was just Amelia, and maybe her friends had come over anyway. So I crept down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs, when suddenly, everything went silent, replaced by the haunting clang of silverware dropping to the floor. I think it's worth noting that it was almost midnight, yet the dining room lights flickered as if someone were playing tricks with the switch. Out of curiosity and more than a little fear, I tiptoed down, half expecting to find my family enjoying some last-minute preparations. To my utter confusion, the dining table was set for an extravagant meal, plates stacked, candles burning, but no one was there. A chill crept up my spine, and I suddenly felt like an intruder in my own home. I felt compelled to call out, "Hello?" But the words barely left my lips when I saw the centerpiece, a grotesque arrangement of wilted flowers, and beneath them lay a note in Amelia's unmistakable handwriting, "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, heart pounding, convinced it was some cruel prank. I backed away slowly, intending to bolt upstairs, but as I turned, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past, quick and darting like a live thing. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I found myself paralyzed. It felt as if I were awaiting something profound. When I finally gathered the courage to rush back to my room, I slammed the door and locked it tight, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever I'd just witnessed at bay. That night, I hardly slept, plagued by uneasy thoughts filled with what festered between Amelia and me. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with an odd sense of dread I couldn't shake. As my family began to arrive, I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to engage in the usual small talk. Every now and then, I would glance toward the front door, half expecting a bustling group of Amelia's friends to barge in, but they never did. A creeping confusion and guilt gnawed at me as I remembered Amelia's tear-streaked face, that feeling of something undisclosed shared in those fleeting moments before she left. But when the dinner bell rang and we settled at the table, there was an emptiness around us that felt wrong. I hadn't noticed it before, but Amelia's absence cast a shadow over everything. Her seat lay conspicuously empty, and as the food was served, a hush fell over my family, like we were missing someone vital. I tried to swallow my unease, laughing at my uncle's jokes while the rest picked through their food absent-mindedly, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Amelia to walk in with a smile and an entourage. But she didn't arrive. During a quiet moment, I ventured the question everyone seemed hesitant to voice, "Where's Amelia?" My mom stiffened, and the air soured. "She canceled last minute," my dad muttered, eyeing me as if I were the cause of this mischief. A suffocating silence followed, and just as I thought the tension might snap, my younger brother piped up, "Hey, isn't that her car?" Our gaze turned toward the window, where the faint, unmistakable outline of Amelia's old Honda sat in the fading twilight. But Amelia didn't emerge from the vehicle, nor did anyone else. I felt a pang of worry shoot through me as I realized besides that strange note, I hadn't spoken with her since our argument. Just as I was about to suggest we check on her, a sudden shudder rattled the house, and the lights flickered ominously. For a heartbeat, everything went pitch black, and I could hear the muffled panic inside the house, my family's voices blending into a chaotic symphony of fear. When the lights returned with an angry flicker, our eyes found the windows, which revealed a reflection I'll never forget. There, pressed to the glass, was Amelia, her eyes wide and frantic, mouth moving as if she were screaming. But the sound, it didn't reach us. In that horrific moment, I felt something wrench inside my chest, a sense of cold accusation settling firmly in my gut. I didn't know what I'd unleashed by saying Amelia couldn't invite her friends. I lunged for the door, my heart pounding, but before I could escape, the house became agonizingly still. Drawing in a breath, unsure whether to feel more terror or dread, I realized something was terribly wrong, as if an uninvited guest had slipped silently into our home, something that lurked and stared from the corners of our lives. Thanksgiving dinner turned into a nightmare, family gathered around shivering in silence, while outside, the world was hushed, and the only sound was the echo of Amelia's voiceless scream. I never went outside that night. I was too scared, paralyzed by the unknown lurking just beyond the door. The next morning, without any explanation, they found Amelia's car empty and her gone, no trace of her anywhere. The police didn't find a single clue. As days blurred into weeks, no one ever spoke of her disappearance, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother about her, all she would say was, "You shouldn't have asked her not to invite her friends." When Thanksgiving came around again a year later, the dread returned, settling on my shoulders like a curse. Amelia was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, it was all my fault. Even now, as the holidays draw near, I can't look at the empty chair where she used to sit at the table without feeling an icy sensation clawing at my insides. You might think it's just the guilt, but deep down, I know it's more than that. Those shadows cast by our family dinners have grown darker, something unseen digs into my gut, festering with secrets. And even today, I still hear her laughter echo through the walls, diluted yet almost tangible, taunting me like a warning of what happens when you tell someone they can't invite their friends for Thanksgiving.